Hi everyone. Thank you for coming to Math's event this evening. As I'm sure you're all aware, our topic is highly current, so it's going to be fascinating to hear our speakers' talks today. Unfortunately, our moderator, Dr. Selleck, was hit with a last-minute illness, so won't be with us this evening. But it's my pleasure to introduce the panel now. So firstly, we have Dr. Simon A. Waldman, who's a visiting lecturer at the Department of Defence Studies at King's College London. Then we have Dr. Ahmed Ali Ozturk, an associate professor of politics and international relations at London Metropolitan University. And lastly, we have Mr. Güney Yildiz, a London-based researcher and journalist specializing in Turkey, Syria, Kurds, and the Middle East. So if you're ready to begin your kind of opening statements, then yeah.
Do you know which order?
No, we lost our moderator, so I can start.
Oh.
Yeah, well, thank you for the introduction. Thank you for having us. I'm looking forward to what you're going to have to say in the Q&A and my panelists. So this is going to be great. So thank you for having me. I think it's inconceivable that the elections that will take place in May or June is not going to focus on the terrible earthquake which recently happened. My position is I doubt very much that the physical earthquake will translate into a political earthquake in Turkey. Now, my PhD supervisor used to say to me, in these kind of events, when you're talking about an upcoming election or an upcoming event, you're not supposed to make predictions, or you're supposed to kind of hedge yourself and say, this is going to happen, but there's a possibility of something else. And, I know this is getting recorded, so, if he's watching, he's going to say, why did you do this? But I'm going to make a prediction. I don't think that the opposition is going to make any significant gains in the forthcoming election. It is conceivable, it is possible that perhaps the main opposition might win one institution that's coming up for election, because the forthcoming elections are parliamentary elections and also presidential elections. But for any change to happen in Turkey, you need to win both. If the opposition, for example, wins parliament, then the president, which will be President Erdogan, will just block everything that happens in parliament and nothing will get done. So you have to win both. But I don't even think the opposition will win in parliament either. I think that it's highly likely that the incumbents, the Justice and Development Party, and Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, the president, will win both parliamentary and presidential elections in the upcoming elections. Now, if I'm wrong, please forgive me. It's okay to be wrong, right? It's all right. And I don't mind being wrong. But if I'm right, remember me. I said it. Right? So forget if I'm wrong, remember if I'm right. From this earthquake, one of the takeaways from me, and I think it was quite obvious, is just the difference between the messages being relayed by the different sides. From the perspective of the incumbent, of the government, this has been a natural disaster of an unprecedented scale, which would be impossible for any government to cope with. And if you look at the message from the opposition parties and also just individuals venting their frustration and their anger on social media, it's things along the lines of criticizing the government's handling of the earthquake, not using the military, who would be perhaps best equipped to deal with this kind of disaster, the inefficiency of the emergency services, not reaching to getting to places, zoning policies. The list really goes on about some of the inadequacies of the response. So the messages are very different. And the reason why I highlight messages is the next election is going to be about the message. And when it comes to the message, the government and its supporters are going to have an advantage. And I'll get to that a little bit more later. Now, with these criticisms of the government's handling of the earthquake, the question is, will this translate into votes and a vote change? Now, one could say, well, if you look at the region, 15% of the population, of all of Turkey's population, were affected by the recent earthquake. Of them, 55%, I'm sorry, had voted for the AKP in previous elections. And then there's the rest of Turkey as well. There's those in Ankara and Istanbul and Izmir who are watching with horror on television or following it on social media, absolutely horrified by the handling of the crisis. They were absolutely shocked by the responses. Some had actually volunteered their services and seen the devastation firsthand and some of the incompetencies. Others had just, had friends and family who were telling them about what had happened. Well, they then changed their vote in the forthcoming election. Now, back in 1999, there was a huge earthquake which hit the Marmara area. And, most of you probably won't remember that. Perhaps some of you had heard of it, but that at its time was a momentous development which took place. Something like 18,000, at least 18,000 people lost their lives, probably thousands more. And the devastation could be felt right on the other side of the Istanbul region. Now, back in 1999, 3 years later, there were elections in 2002, and there was a change of government. And the change of the government was to the Justice and Development Party. And there's really three reasons. I would put three reasons why in 2002 the Justice and Development Party won. One, they managed to brand themselves as a bunch of reformed Islamists who are now committed to democracy, and they had some liberals who would basically back them up with that kind of imaging. It was also the handling of the earthquake. The handling of the earthquake by the government, the coalition government at the time, was terrible. It was a disaster. And for many Turks, it meant that there needed to be some kind of change of government because what was taking place was inadequate. And also by 2001, Turkey had been hit by a huge economic crisis. Now, you would think that, if that's happened in 2002 elections and it had led to a change of government, maybe that's the same now. Maybe history's looping. Now, I would say not quite. There was a big difference back in 1999. Then the government hadn't been centralized to the extent that it is now. So in recent years, under Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, the presidency is now a very important position. It is the most important position in Turkish politics. In 1999, it was a parliamentary system. Now it's a presidential system, an executive presidency. The checks and balances are eroded, and it's essentially a centralized system. Now, at first, you would think that's a disadvantage for the current government, right? Because when people hit by the earthquake are saying, where is the state? Are by extension saying, where is the government? Where is the AKP? Where is Recep Tayyip Erdoğan, right? But it's a little bit different now. Because on the other hand of this, the institutions of the state, the messages are now under stronger control of the government, dominating the media, dominating the airways, and they have the monopoly on power. So what essentially happens is the government will put a message along the lines of, who is looking after your interests? Who are the people who ensured that those affected by the earthquake would not lose their jobs? The AKP and Recep Tayyip Erdoğan. Who would make sure that interest rates won't increase so you won't get bankrupt? The AKP and Erdogan. Who is rebuilding your homes immediately and pledges to make it completely built within the next 12 months? AKP and your big brother Erdogan, who has just last week passed legislation to allow millions of Turks to retire early and, of course, to receive a state pension. This is almost like buying votes, right? The AKP and Erdogan. And then there's the other side of the message, which will be, can Kılıçdaroğlu, who's now the opposition's candidate, can he do it? Would he represent your interests? Can he build your home within 1 year? We can, we're doing it now. Maybe he'll disrupt it. And then what will take place, as was in the case in 2014, 2018, is a character assassination of any presidential candidate that goes against Erdogan, relentlessly. Same thing with the other major parties. Now, will Erdogan and the AKP lose votes? Well, it's possible. Now, let's look at polling, right? Now, there has been some polls that have come out after the earthquake, right? And were conducted after the initial earthquake happened. And it was along the lines of this. The AKP predicted, and we're talking about 5 or 6 different polls with varying rates of how many people they interviewed, but usually above 2,000, anywhere from 2 to 4,000. The AKP, 29.1 to 40%, quite wide, right? The CHP, which is the main left-wing, slightly left-of-center opposition, 23 to 28%. The E Party, the right-wing nationalist party, 10 to 19%. So those are the two parties which are the big ones in terms of the opposition. The HDP, the People's Democratic Party, which is a liberal, progressive, pro-Kurdish, 8 to 12%. And the MHP, which is a coalition party of the AKP, 5 to 10%. Now, those who have been paying attention to polling will know that that's not much different to how it was before the earthquake. In other words, there hasn't been much of a change. The divisions within Turkish politics are practically the same after the earthquake as they were before. But there's some bad news along the way. The HDP, who got 8 to 12%, they may not be around for the next election because the Constitutional Court may actually ban the party, and that means that their politicians will have to run as independents, and that's not good in terms of how that gets calculated into parliament. The CHP, 23 to 28%, that's what it always gets. That means they're not gaining any traction from angry voters. The E Party, up to 19%. Well, they always kind of vote they've done well the last election in polling, but when it actually came to the votes, they plummeted, and that could happen again. And it seems to be, it's going to be the swing voter, the ones who are undecided, who will essentially determine the outcome of the election. Now, despite this earthquake, it's important to remember that the Turkish voter has proved to be quite pragmatic. If you recall, in 2015, there were elections, and the AKP didn't get a majority. It got something like 40% of the vote. And there was then an attempt to build a coalition. It didn't happen. The economy started to shake, the lira tumbled, and when elections were then held a few months later, all of a sudden it picked up 9% of the vote and was able to form a coalition. It was able to form a majority government. And the reason because of that was the economy. And I think the same thing can happen this time around too. And before the election, the AKP, having put forward all of these different messages, Erdogan as well, will gain those voters who are basically thinking along the lines of stability would gain them the vote, as opposed to voting the opposition, which doesn't guarantee anything in Turkey in the next few years. And on that disappointing note, I'm going to kind of cut the rest of what I was going to say and perhaps put it into the Q&A after, and then pass it to my colleagues so I can hear what they have to say. Thank you very much.
What did you do to our audience? Actually, they're all sad right now about the early elections. So we have been knowing each other for a while, and before the panel discussion, we talked that he's representing the pessimist side. You know, he's sitting like between us a little bit, and I'm the optimistic side about the election. So I'll just try to solve this weather right now. I mean, I've been sharing many things. What did you say? But like, I'll try to describe a little bit of the AKP story, and then I'll try to show you the similarities between the AKP's political methodology and the current opposition parties, opposition groups, or the coalitions methodology. I mean, as an associate professor has been gaining his pocket money to explaining Turkey and working on Turkey, I would easily say that none of the emperors, governors, prime ministers, or presidents of Anatolia never ever sit the chair alone. Even the magnificent Süleyman, the conqueror, the Mehmet, even Atatürk, the founder of Turkey, and either Recep Tayyip Erdoğan didn't sit their chair alone. They always created a different kind of a coalitions, even though they came to power alone on the paper. And in 2002, after the earthquake, after a massive economic crisis and the political crisis as well, Erdogan has managed to create a kind of a coalition, which is, I'm defining that coalition is an unofficial, unconventional coalition. What does it mean? That after the many tutelage regimes and many different kind of the bureaucratic blockages, Kemalist or secular, whatsoever, how you define it, they're coming from the same basket. Erdogan and his colleagues managed to create a kind of a top-up political party or top-up political power. What I'm saying that top-up, conservatives, pro-EU members, some of the Kurdish groups, liberals, some of the social democrats, so on and so forth. And he came to power in 2002 with a quite optimistic agenda. He said that I take off my Islamist shirt and hang it out, and I'm now putting a conservative, liberal new jacket. What does it mean? That even though I'm a Muslim actor, I'm a Muslim political actor, I'll be fine with the EU principles, with the neoliberal based on capitalist market system. And my way is not to turn Turkey to the east, but instead to the west. So he gave us many different promises, and this has created a different kind of coalition, both at home and abroad. And until 2013, he has been in coalition with many different groups, such as important public figures, they're mostly based on the liberal backgrounds. They have been glorifying Erdogan's policies both at home and abroad. He has created a different coalition with the parapolitical Islamist structure, what we call the Gülen movement. They have been using their schools, their universities, their business associations as a kind of a public policy tool or kind of an advertisement machine around the world. And in Turkey, they've been very good with the main media, so on and so forth. But what happened roughly after 2011, 2013, and 2016? Erdogan realized that this liberal agenda, this liberal mottos is not working very well under the shrinking economic conditions. And he decided that it's not okay to go with that coalition with liberals, pro-EU members, Gülen movement, so on and so forth. And he just remembered his old shirt, which is an Islamic and a nationalist and a little bit of repressive for 2013, I would say a little bit. Right now, it's not a little bit indeed. And he became much more aggressive, starting from the Gezi Park protest, and then the unknown bloody coup attempts, and then the regime or the system change. He created a kind of a little bit beyond a new system, which is a little bit beyond under the definition of the competitive authoritarianism. He created a presidential system that we can easily define that it's a la Turca style presidency. What does it mean, that a la Turca? I mean, okay, it's coming with the popular votes and picking up the ministers from his team or abroad and bypassing the parliament. But the a la Turca style is that even though Turkey is amongst the G20 countries, it's a long state history and heritage, so on and so forth, Erdogan tried to dissolve and dysfunction all the institutions in Turkey. That is why the earthquake that was I wouldn't define the earthquake as a natural disaster. It's a political disaster. Because what we saw that, I mean, even a single institution couldn't manage to work properly during the earthquake. So neither military nor other institutions, even the pro-government civil society couldn't manage to help the people during the earthquake. And we saw that one state structure with all the institutions belongs only one individual. And this individual's current coalition partners are Islamists, Sunni Islamic groups. I'm not saying that the pro-Muslim civil society, no, like Orthodox Islamist groups. Nationalists, but as Simon said that right now the nationalists divided into a couple of pieces, and I'm not sure it's theoretically an appropriate definition, but the liberal or the soft nationalists now staying with the E party, good party, but the hardcore is with the MHP, Nationalist Action Party, so on and so forth. Erdogan has been creating that kind of coalition at home, and for the abroad, he's been together with the Eurasianists. What does it mean, Eurasianists? They believe that the Turkey's way shouldn't be being belong to West, instead should be with Russia, should be with China, and turn its face to the Eastern countries. That is why right now, for example, not only for that reason, but this is one of the main indicators, Erdogan has been blocking the Sweden's and Finland's joining to NATO. It is not only about he's one way or another helping the Putin's desires, but at the same time he is blocking the new establishment of the Euro-Atlantic security line. So he's playing a repressive and aggressive and annoying role, not only at home but also abroad. So he is not a good friend of the Western powers anymore. This means that he is not he doesn't have any large area to play during the economic crisis, so on and so forth. Under these circumstances, authoritarian country turning its face to the eastern countries like Russia, China, or some authoritarian Turkic countries. Currently, Turkey's economy is something, my English is not enough to define because I'm using always a shrinking economic conditions, but I need to find a harder word to define it. Currently, the Turkish economy is a kind of a disaster. According to the latest Metropole surveys, for example, Metropole is the second biggest survey company in Turkey, and one of the respectful, I would easily say that 78% of the Turkish society thinks that the economy is the biggest problem. And over the last 11 months, Erdogan's job approval rate is lower than 45%. But what we know that if he wants to get the presidency, he needs to get more than 50% of the votes. This is the situation of Erdogan. What about the opposition? I mean, for a long while, I've been writing some columns, some articles about that opposition needs a candidate. And this candidate should be a winning candidate. Because we have an election machine, whose name is Erdogan. According to Aristotelian concept, he's a political animal. He has been in every stage of politics. He's now 69 years old, if I'm not mistaken, 68, 69, and he has been in politics since he's 13. He served in the youth club. He served as the leader of Beyoğlu, one of the major districts of Istanbul. He's been served as the leader of the Istanbul branch of the Virtue Party. He was the mayor. He was president. He knows prime minister, and now he's the president. He knows every single stage of politics. So, if you would like to win an election, such a political animal, he's one of the most experienced political leaders if you don't consider Joe Biden's age, which is true, I mean, in terms of year. So you need to create something different. Current opposition leader, currently candidate of the president's for the opposition, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, former bureaucrat and charismatic person. He's not very good about speaking from the public, so on and so forth. But he created something very similar to Erdogan. One way or another, after 2018, after 2019, he managed to establish not unofficial, but in conventional coalitions. Likewise, Erdogan did. Now he established a table of six different political parties: an Islamist, nationalist, two conservatives, liberal conservatives. One of them is the former Prime Minister Ahmet Davutoğlu. The other one is the former minister, one of the leading ministers of the AKP, Ali Babacan, so on and so forth. And yesterday, he announced his candidacy and he said, okay, these six guys will be my vice presidents. Instead, I am getting a support as a vice president from two big cities' mayors. Mayor of Istanbul, Ekrem İmamoğlu, Mayor of Ankara, Mansur Yavaş. And don't consider these six leaders from the other opposition. Just look at the main platform. Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, Alevi, not Sunni, which is a minority religious group, Muslim religious group in Turkey, coming from Dersim, which is the pro-Kurdish area, representing something. The other person, Ekrem İmamoğlu, from Trabzon, from Black Sea region, Sunni. And he's a kind of his attitude is kind of a right-wing political actor and very similar to Erdogan and very similar to Turgut Özal, a former president. The other person, Mansur Yavaş, from Beypazarı, from central Anatolia, one of the districts of Ankara, coming from a national background, and Sunni. This is the other top-up coalition that can defeat Erdogan. This is the optimistic part of the story. On the other side of the story, yes, which is true, Erdogan has been controlling all of the state apparatus right now, including bureaucracy, security, and intelligence service, and most probably deep state. And we know that how he belongs to his chair, his power, because he and his team will lose many things if they can lose their power. Therefore, he will try to do everything. You know, everyone has been watching Netflix TV series in here, right? There are some TV series, every episode is 45 minutes, 45 minutes, 45 minutes, but the last episode is around 1 hour and 20. Turkey has been right now starting its last episode, about 80 people. This will be a very long 2 or 2.5 months. We can expect anything right now for these two groups, because what we know that Erdogan is eager to keep his power and the others are very eager to get this power. So I wouldn't have any prediction, as Simon. I mean, I'm very agree for you, but my feeling is that this is the time when you consider over the previous 2 decades, this is the only time Erdogan, a competitive authoritarian leader, can be defeated by election. If it will happen, Turkey will write a new history. This will be a good opportunity for us for the new theoretical articles, because it will be one of the unique examples how the competitive authoritarian regimes can be changed by polling. This is an opportunity. But if not, no one will get Erdogan's chair. Only he will leave his chair or he will lapse. So I am very optimistic, and I'm very much wondering, and I'm very much in fear about what's going to happen over the next 2 months as a Turkish citizen, as a humankind. But at the same time, I know that this is the last hope for the modern Turkey. This will be a newest Turkey after the 14th of May, or we will say that rest in peace, modern Turkey. Thank you so much. And I'm very much hoping to clarify some of the gray points and discuss with you about the pessimism and optimism. Thank you so much, guys.
Thank you both. I mean, it's already been established that in Turkey, both geological fault lines and political fault lines are very active at the moment, simultaneously. And both are interrelated. As we know, like the political decisions on construction, regulations, or urban planning, and the rescue operations affect the death toll in earthquakes. So the politics affects disasters, and it's anticipated that it should be vice versa. Like people would change their voting behavior based on how government, government's performance in rescue operations, at least. But as Simon also alluded to, some recent polls suggest that the influence of the earthquake on voting pattern is not as big as as the effect of earthquake itself, in terms of the people didn't change their voting behavior as much. But there's an important saying in public saying in Turkish that on fortune telling, like never believe in fortune telling, but do not make any decisions without fortune telling. That's how I approach polling, the polling companies. Albeit I know head of some of the companies and respect them a lot. Still, polling is one thing, and what people think can be another. And so I want to talk about the earthquake and response failures, and also the political fault lines and how both of them affect elections, both political fault lines and earthquake response failures. So the Turkish government's failures, the shortcomings in responding to recent earthquake can be divided into 3 categories. And I'll try to focus on points that are relevant to the election. So first one is the inflexible planning. So despite the country having a disaster management agency, predicting a similar magnitude earthquake in 2018 in one of the epicenters of this earthquake. You couldn't be as close to the reality as possible. Like they correctly predicted that there will be an earthquake in one of the 2 epicenters. They had all their simulations, but what they planned was that the earthquake will affect one city, and then they will bring in help and rescue missions from other neighboring towns. When the earthquake affected 10 cities all at once, including those cities who were supposed to be providing rescue to one of the cities. Then that planning didn't work in practice. And there were like additional scandals of like Turkey's Red Crescent scandalously selling tents at a moment of disaster rather than providing them to people. The second shortcoming was poor coordination. So there are countless of testimonies from rescue groups, volunteers on the ground, and victims that the coordination was really bad, which to observers of Turkey should come as a surprise, actually, because Turkey has a very strong security apparatus. So this apparatus is Turkish military is operating in several different countries, like in across the border in Iraqi Kurdistan, in Syria, had planned the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, in Caucasus, active in Libya, and from Ethiopia, Somalia. There's so many different countries, and also present in selling weapons, at least to Ukraine. So you might imagine a military security organization that can operate in war situations should be able to operate in their own country, coordinating efforts. But they were curiously they weren't present, and the GSM networks were down, for example, in many places. The military was not on the ground, and the security agencies didn't play a significant role in the early, very important early days of the earthquake. The third failure was a politicized response by the government. So instead of starting a unifying narrative, bringing in people, civil society, all political actors, coalescing them to help the victims, the government officials from the first moments acted to suppress information rather than promoting cooperation and communication. I mentioned the poor coordination. Twitter, for example, which as a platform I'm not necessarily a fan of, played a very significant role in coordinating rescue efforts. People actually tweeted their whereabouts, and people became aware of them, and the rescue operations were coordinated accordingly. So they slowed down the Twitter because of disinformation, so-called disinformation. There were disinformation, but there's no proof that any of that the disinformation or wrongly disseminated information on Twitter caused any lives. But clearly, I think slowing down Twitter might have caused many, many lives during those very significant times, early hours, I mean. Officials also discouraged opposition and municipalities on civil society organizations from helping. And one of the most active Turkish state institutions during the earthquake was Turkish communication, Presidency's communication agency, communication presidency. I remember reading, a decade ago, by some figures who is now in the presidency, talking about perception management. This concept actually developed by think tanks or people close to the CIA about like how you can perceive, you can manage perception. And there were many critical articles by people who were close to the government about this perception management, and they were seeing it as an adverse or like a hostile move by the West against the Turkish government. But I'm a bit surprised that they actually were both the argument, but like they're very much into perceiving, managing the perception themselves. So this last point, this last, what I call failure, actually explain to a certain degree why people are not reacting as much as it could be anticipated to government failures, is because government controls much of the broadcast media. So if you watch pro-government media, which I did for a period, try to get that perception, you would actually think the state was present from the first moment and things were okay, and people died because of natural disasters, not as I argued, for political reasons. Like so if you don't necessarily go onto social media or opposition channels, then you would have the idea that things were normal. So perception management was very powerful, but it's still early to conclude that the earthquake won't have a significant influence on elections. I think these points are also relevant internationally. Like imagine like a British government failing hugely in COVID response, which some might argue that they did, and had no effect on electorate. I mean, that won't be a kind of a country people would like to live in. The second topic is the political fault lines. It's an unfortunate metaphor, but I was seeing the issue from using this metaphor long before the actual earthquake hit Turkey. So these political fault lines affect the opposition disproportionately, because, as Erdi argued, the coalition that the opposition, the leader of the opposition brought together. So we have almost a rainbow coalition, as Erdi explained. There's a political Islamist, or at least a conservative Islamist party, from which the current AK Party split it from. And there are two other, more liberal and also conservative parties that were splitted from the AK Party later. And there's also almost an ultra-nationalist party. There are seculars, there are liberals, and also the Kurds supporting this coalition from outside. So Erdogan, I think President Erdogan believed that, rationally, I would say, that this coalition won't stick around together. It's for long, that it will be easy to break them apart, or they would, they will go different ways themselves. So there were three fault lines, clear fault lines. One of them is the Kurdish issue in this, the opposition alliance. The second one is, I think, is less pronounced, but it's the Alevi issue. I mean, I'll explain what I mean. And the third fault line was who's going to be the candidate, the main candidate. And President Erdogan very easily, very conveniently poked all these fault lines. Like, for example, he demonized and criminalized the Kurdish opposition, which is currently the third largest party in the parliament, and criminalized everyone who has any kind of contact with them, including the opposition. But then he was also, as a pragmatic, flexible political leader, he sent his own ministers to speak to the Kurdish party. All of these, messages sent shockwaves across the opposition. And there were many comments by different parts of the opposition that actually wasn't helpful in winning hearts and minds of the Kurds. So people actually, when they saw the government and the opposition commenting on the Kurdish issue, they saw very little difference. The second one is the Alevi issue. As it's been mentioned, the current leader, the opposition candidate for presidency is Alevi. And there were very strong opposition to his candidacy from within the opposition, from the secular parts of the opposition as well. So, Turkey usually, just as a parenthesis, is understood simplistically as being divided by secularists and Islamists. Secularists being pure secularists, Islamists being pure Islamists, or from them between Democrats and autocrats. Unfortunately, the reality is very much more complex. There's some sectarianism among secularists as well. Sometimes more than the Islamists themselves. So one of the Islamist parties, for example, I mentioned, had no qualms about the candidacy of Kılıçdaroğlu, for example, this Alevi candidate, but the more secular parts of the opposition raised many criticisms, and their main argument was that if an Alevi becomes a presidential candidate, President Erdogan is going to use it, and people won't against him, his identity, and people won't vote for him. At the same time, President Erdogan, for the first time in Turkish state history, officially recognized the Alevi prayer houses. When this debate was happening among the opposition, prayer houses under culture ministry. Obviously, that wasn't what Alevis wanted, because they don't want to be recognized as a cultural institution, but as a religious institution. But still, it was for some better than nothing. That it was a step in that direction. And the third one was the candidate. Who's going to be the candidate? That fault line. With that, the Istanbul mayor was the potential candidate in most people's eyes in Turkey. And what President Erdogan did was, demonizing him, and then the courts started a case, a political case against him, which, a case against the Istanbul mayor blocking actually his candidacy. When that happened, so when the main candidate was knocked off from the, from the platform, the Alevi Kılıçdaroğlu's candidacy became much more prominent, and then the debates began, started to be more intense among the opposition. So, and it also affected there were so many stress tests on this, and the last one was just 2-3 days ago when the second largest party in the opposition alliance walked away from the alliance. So Erdogan was very conveniently poked all these 3 fault lines, and all caused in tremors in the opposition. But strangely, this opposition platform is proved to be extremely resilient. Like despite people who you wouldn't normally think to be in to remain in one room for extended periods, have been sticking together for a long time. I think the main reason, and they stood against many stress tests, the main I think reason is that there's a natural alliance, which is I think broadly a positive thing for broader Turkish society. There's a natural alliance in the among the masses, among the electorate. It's not just an elite thing. It's more like there's an alliance and overlapping among the masses of supporters of these political parties. So even if the elites are, do not get on well or have problems among each other, the masses, I think, are putting pressure on their leaders to stick together. So there's some wisdom among the electorate. The second, another reason is that all these people have different political ideologies among the opposition, but one of the main, strongest movements in Turkey is now anti-Erdoganism. Turkey is very much, divided, maybe 50-50 between pro-Erdogan camp, or maybe less than 50 for pro-Erdogan camp, and anti-Erdogan camp on the other side. So even if their leaders, debate among each other, and even if they don't agree on many different things, the electorate, they can still stick together. So that is how it affects the political fault lines, affects the opposition. I'll just say a couple of words on the Kurds and about what may the government do against this. So the Kurds, polling between 8 to 12%. So I would say even they polled higher in the past. And if you are a person who's going to vote for the Kurds, for the Kurdish party, I think you would be less inclined to mention that to a pollster who's calling you from your mobile phone because of the criminalization of that political movement. So I think polls, I'm sure they are counting that in, factoring that factor in, but still we don't necessarily know how. But they clearly demonstrated in the past that these people may not be the kingmakers, but they are the Kurds are can decide on who's not going to be the king. At least, and I think they have a strong influence on the result of the presidential candidate from the opposition. Their strong veto against one of the nationalist candidates, for example, has blocked that candidate's way and made it possible for the current leader of the opposition to become a candidate. It's not clear whether the Kurds are aware of it or CHP are aware of it, but I think the influence is there. I mean, the Kurds have traditionally preferred the opposition to the government, which some of you, if you're following the Turkish history closely, might find it strange because it was the current government who actually started the peace process, or what they call the resolution process, with the PKK, the main Kurdish militant group. Despite that fact, the Kurdish electorate stood with the opposition. I think there are a few reasons for this. One of them was that there was never a mutual trust between Erdogan and the Kurdish leadership, and the process was much more led by Kurdish actors within the AK Party, which many of them are not inside the party now. And during that time, the opposition under Kılıçdaroğlu didn't harm the process. Like it is very easy for an opposition party to bang on the nationalist rhetoric to prevent any kind of talk with Kurdish groups, which is now what the Turkish government is doing, actually, preventing any negotiations or any contact with the Kurdish legal, even the legal party. What would the government do, against this? Like, are they going to? There's a huge momentum behind the opposition. I think, you know, in my career, I used to be a political advisor as well at the House of Commons for Foreign Affairs Select Committee. So that stayed with me, like how I would advise the government do in, you know, if I were in their position. This is a professional advice. It's not necessarily good for democracy or human rights at all, but polarization, I think, is the way you know, they'll try to go. You know, the Turkish society is already polarized, but the polarization levels is increasing, and the more polarized the society is, there's less flow of information from the opposition to the government supporter side. That's one reason why they don't necessarily believe in government's failures in the earthquake zone, for example. And polarization was also good because of the fault lines I mentioned, political fault lines. So if there are some arguments that if you stick on to that, you'll definitely lose. Like, you remember the Brexit argument, like take back control or fund the NHS. There's no way, you know, anyone can win against that argument. But if in Turkish context, if you you know, focus on the polarization on the Kurdish issue rather than the response to the earthquake, or on Alevi issue or religious sensitivities rather than the economic issues, then, you know, you have a better chance of winning that argument, or at least there will be two sides to the argument. You won't necessarily lose. So government may not be able to make people think the way they want to think, but they with the control over the media, they can shape the agenda. They can force people to talk about the issues they choose. So they can't make them, they can't persuade them what they wanted to persuade them, but they can make them talk about other issues rather than the main issues that will harm them. The last question is that, you know, there's this whole speculation about whether the government, you know, after all these years, after all this control over the media, the states, the security agencies, the broader bourgeoisie, whether they will be able to, they will concede defeat, you know, or whether, you know, what they will bypass democratic process. You know, I think my only prediction will be on that, and I have a stronger position that they won't be able to. I think you know, both the Turkish states, the equations, political equations, the power equations there, and the electorate's position will make it clear that if the margin of defeat against the government is beyond 1 or 2%, they will have to concede to the defeat, and you know, then we might be able to talk about the transition after that. But whether, you know, they will lose the election, yeah, that will require more debate to come to a conclusion, I think. Thank you very much for having us, yeah, and I look forward to hearing your questions.
Yeah, thank you. I think we can jump straight to the Q&A, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Any questions? Just raise your hand and pass to the panel. And can I just ask you to restate the question briefly for the Zoom audience because of the microphone? Okay. Please.
I want to, because we've been talking about the elections, and I kind of want to ask about how does it feel like, because when I'm reading like Western media towards like the Turkish earthquake, it's kind of dehumanizing. It's basically going straight to the elections rather than the actual fact that more than 40,000 people lost their lives. And, you know, going straight to the argument that Erdogan is a sultan or whatever, kind of deoriented this argument. I kind of like, and this is more like a comment rather than a question, like, is this the appropriate thing to do, given that such a calamity has happened, to be talking straight about the elections rather than the dehumanizing process?
Yeah. Yeah. So the question was, is it right to be talking about the elections when such a humanitarian catastrophe has happened? And yeah, I grappled with the same question. And you know, when the earthquake was happening, you know, I started in political animal that I am. The first thing I started thinking about was elections, you know, reading the news from that lens. And I'm thinking to myself, is that right? what's wrong with me, right? But then I realized that that's what all the political parties are doing themselves, especially the incumbents, the government, and in terms of the messages that are being portrayed, that was all political factoring in mind. And then I was thinking, well, to ignore that would be wrong as well, right? So that's how I kind of grappled with that. That's how I thought about that. But I think it's a very, very fair point that you're making. Yeah.
And also, it's very understandable. Was it Financial Times who declared that one of the most important events of 2023?
Bloomberg, yeah.
Bloomberg, the economic, sorry, it's the Turkish election. I mean, two things I think quite important. The first thing is that, I mean, I've been living abroad more than 12 years, and UK is my 6th country in here. And I can easily compare Turkey with Sweden, with Slovenia, with US, with the UK. Turkey is a highly politicized society. I mean, I'm a political scientist, and trust me, everyone said that you don't know about politics. I know better than you, because everyone knows politics very well, and everyone is a kind of a political actor. For example, the turnout percentage in the UK, if I'm not mistaken, it's less than 50%, and in Turkey it's higher than 85%. I mean, people are very politicized. This is the reason. The political area is very large, particularly under President Erdogan. He politicized every single subject. This is the second thing. And the other thing is that, I mean, okay, there will be an election in the UK in 2 years, and most probably there will be a government change, right? If everything will go like that, it's highly possibility the Labour will come to power. They may stay in 10 years, and then the Tories will come, and then the Labours. The system will stay. But in here, we are not talking only about election. This is something about the future of country, future of individuals. Because, I mean, for example, there has been a huge migration from Turkey to the outside of the Turkish territories, because people are hopeless. Particularly youth people will see no hope in Turkey, and they're trying to escape from the country, democratic Western heaven. So this election is not an election. So this is the reason why the earthquake is that's linked to the election.
I mean, you're right on a emotional level, but first, what Western media writes about Turkey is not necessarily. I mean, it tells you more about what the Western analysts think about Turkey than what is happening in Turkey. And as you know, both speakers said, Turkish political parties, including the government. I mean, I mentioned political response, politicized response as one of the failures. I mean, that was their first reaction anyway. And if you agree with Erdi, which I fully do, on this being a political disaster as well as a natural disaster, it's a natural disaster. That's for sure. But it was exacerbated both by the previous regulations and urban planning, as well as the failure in responses. So if it is a political issue, then we can talk about it politically. Thirdly, political groups, professional political groups, regard everything politically in every crisis moment. I mean, let me give you an example that we wouldn't necessarily need to debate on. ISIS, for example. The moment the earthquake hit Syria, the moment they decided, like, oh, this is the moment that we can increase our attacks. This is how political groups think, and that is, if they do think like that, I think we among citizens should be able to, at least understand their thinking. Another argument is that when people die, yes, I think there needs to be a moment of silence and respect. But when a disaster, when people are continuing to die, like this disaster, I mean, it's the most serious in my lifetime. I think I mean, I was traumatized from all this distance. I can't even imagine how people are coping on the ground, because it wasn't like that 50,000 people, which is going to be unfortunately much higher, died at an instant. We actually followed them, dying and tweeting about their situation, and then dying in a couple of days because there was no help going towards them. So people were continuing to die. It's not like we can't remain silent and start paying our respects. It was an ongoing process. And lastly, I remember one social media comment by a geologist, I think, talking about the economic cost of this to people, and people were also reacting in a way similar to you, saying, "Oh, people died. Like, why are you talking about the economy?" But actually, when people die, I mean, there's a metric that the World Bank uses and other maybe institutions as well, that they calculate, for example, let's say the average age of population is, let's say, 50. And if 10,000 people died and their ages varies between 10 to 50, you calculate, you say, for example, if somebody died when he was 25-year-old, they lost 25 potential years of their life because the average life is 50. But when you factor in the economic calculation, the factors in, you realize that yes, 50,000 people died, but the remaining 10 million people, because of the economic costs, are also going to lose from their lives. Both their living conditions, but also actual days of their lives. And that figure is usually much higher than the actual deaths. So it is a political and economic issue. Maybe it's not something that you would choose to discuss with the victims or on the ground when you're delivering aid or you're in a rescue mission. But if you're away, and I think there's room for that cold-blooded analysis too. I hope I was able to express myself well, because it's a sensitive and emotional issue.
Any other questions in the room?
So thinking from the options perspective, I guess, sorry.
It's not about you.
If anti-Erdogan team were to win, do you think the opposition has the capacity to manage the power? Because they have been sort of for 20-ish plus years. And also because like pro-Erdogan, that's one thing. Anti-Erdogan has also segments and stuff. So if and should they come to power, are there going to be arguments within that perspective, like anti-Erdogan perspective? And because there are three main people, as you said, are there going to be arguments that can't be predicted, and that's going to cause more chaos, I guess?
Can I ask you briefly, Lucy?
Oh my God, I'm not a native speaker, so she basically asked that, if there will be a power change, whether they can stay in power and they transform the country. This is the basic of this, the first part of the question. The second part of the question, if I'm not mistaken, it's about whether the opposition group will get the power, whether they can manage to reform the country or create a new vision, or they will stick with the anti-Erdogan discourse or the policies, right? You go first, or who? Can I go first?
It was just to the positive, Ken.
Okay, I may go first.
I agree with the essence of the question.
No, I mean, on the reformation theories, starting from the beginning of the 20th century, like Spain, Italy, and then some of the North African countries, Russia, and what we know that there are three different alphabets is important. After authoritarian leaders, regimes, there might be three different alphabetic ways can be done. The first one is the V shape. The second one is the U shape. The third one is the L shape. I'm not sure whether Turkey can create another fourth alphabet, but what I know that a couple of things is quite important. The first thing is that before the question, we have to discuss about, you may discuss something about state and how Erdogan is being controlling state or not. I mean, before Erdogan or before 2016, what we know that there's been a government and there is also a state. They're not unified structures. But after 2016, I'm not sure it's an endless, I'm not sure about that. It would be an endless debate whether the state occupied Erdogan or Erdogan occupied state, or they create a kind of a unified structure. So in these circumstances, particularly after the coup attempt, we do not know who is the main controller of the army, who is the leading actor is been controlling the majority of the police forces, judiciary, bureaucracy. Indeed, Erdogan is the biggest player, but from my reading, he's not the only actor. Yes, he's the owner of the big slice of the cake, but there are other slices as well. And during the election time, if the bureaucracy, I mean the security apparatus and the judiciary realize that there might be a power change in Turkey, trust me, I mean, you know, there is an Orientalist belly dancing coming from Turkey, bureaucracies can easily swing his ways. Is it recording, right? Sorry for that. I wouldn't try to say that. Anyway, so the first question is that, how would be the power transition would happen? If you ask me that question a year ago, I would easily say that Turkey has already passed the peaceful power transition. But right now, when I think about the opposition groups, coalition and their identities, for example, if you are looking for a nationalistic security guards from the Erdogan's camp, MHP, there is one as well. If we are looking for a pro-Islamist or conservative Muslim sensitivity groups, there's also another one. If you are looking for a state bureaucracy is coming from the state, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu is, I mean, he's been as a person, Alevi background from Dersim, he's got all the steps into the bureaucracy. So we can see some reflections over there. So in these circumstances, yes, there will be a power transition. It will not that be easy. And then after the power transition, I mean, if you ask me that, Erdi, would you like to be the next president of Turkey? I would definitely say that no, thank you. I'm very happy to be in London Met, because they might be very surprised when they open the all these institutions, backgrounds, and what happens. Most probably in the treasury, they will see there's no money anymore. Institutions are not capable to act. Most probably the only foreign ministry is still solid, but the rest is not very well. I mean, there will be a very difficult and very painful restoration period for Turkey. And I'm a political scientist. I never ever worked as a political advisor. But if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't continue to proceed the anti-Erdoganist discourse, because, okay, there's been a 20 years of Erdogan period with all the pluses and the negative sides, but it should be over. If there will be a newest Turkey, there shouldn't be a anti-Erdoganist discourse, because, I mean, as a Turkish citizen, Erdogan is one of the biggest issues of Turkey, but it's not the only issue. I mean, the polarization, I mean, the gender issue, crime against women, I mean, the freedom of speech, corruption, transparency. I mean, we can count until the morning. So they need to incorporate. The third issue, you didn't mention that, even though, I mean, Kılıçdaroğlu is not an authoritarian leader. He's acting as a kind of an orchestrator chef, right? But 6 different leaders, 2 very charismatic, influential mayors, hungry political and bureaucratic groups. They've been away in the power position in 20 years, and being an away from the power position does not mean away for only power. This means for the economic opportunities and using power, so on and so forth. How he can control these groups. So this is the important part of the issue. So it will be a very difficult process for Turkey, trust me. This is my optimism.
That's your optimism. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
You make me look, you know.
It's not important what is your good. It's important how you're going to sell your good.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, well, look, I agree with a lot of what was just said. I mean, anti-Erdoganism is just not enough. And if you want proof of that, just look, you know, a few hundred, is it 450, 500 miles further south to Israel. You saw an anti-Netanyahu coalition emerge in Israel. It didn't last long, and Netanyahu's back, right? So there needs to be something a little bit stronger than just this kind of anti-Erdoganism. And the problem with the coalition, problem with the opposition, I'm sorry, is that it's just too ideologically different. And I can see a kind of a situation where they can manage, but can they facilitate change? I mean, Turkey's had coalitions in the past, so that's not just it's not as if it's impossible that they can get together and manage a country. They can, but can they facilitate change? Can it be democratic change? Can we use that word, democracy?
Turkish style of
And,
democracy.
it's not going to happen. It's really not going to happen. 2017, that referendum change that turned Turkey into an executive presidency was a fundamental period in Turkish politics where it's hard to envision how that's going to go back. So whoever is being voted for as president, if you're hoping for democracy, you're going to hope that this individual will then give up the power that he has in his possession. Can Kılıçdaroğlu do that? He may not even be able to do that, even if he wants to. To change the coalition, you need 2/3 of parliament. So the opposition needs to win 2/3 of parliament to change the constitution. If they can't get that, it needs to have 3/5 of parliament to change to basically put constitutional changes to the electorate. Would it even get to? Would it even get 3/5? So 60% of parliament. It may not even get that. And then would it win it in a referendum? Perhaps not. So there's so many ifs in terms of just reverting back to the 2017 status quo ante, which wasn't really democratic anyway. I just can't see how there's going to be significant change in Turkey, regardless of who wins the elections coming up. So, that's not going to be decided on these elections. That's going to be decided in the future elections. And one of the other problems that we really haven't, we have talked about it a little bit, we have alluded to it, is this kind of role of individuals. I mean, the E-Party, for example, that's the Meral Action party. At the moment, one of the problems I have with Kılıçdaroğlu is he hasn't run for election within his party since he became the head of the party. And if he's talking about democratic change, he needs to have a leadership election for his own party, which is something that he's resisted doing, despite there being more popular, more able, more capable younger politicians within his party. And there's younger people within the CHP who want some change, who are very active, and they're going to have to wait another 4 or 5 years to basically see their time come. And for there to be democracy, we've got to kind of pull away a little bit from these kind of party politics and hope that there will be more movements emerging within Turkey. Perhaps it's going to happen on a local level. I hope it does, but that's not going to be decided this time around.
Can I just say one
Of course,
sentence before you? Sorry. If they're going to get the support of the Kurds in the parliament, they may reach the 60%.
That depends on how they react.
This is but there is an
I
option.
understand what you mean. It depends on how they react to if the head-to-head gets closed, and because they want to get some votes, the table of 6 don't say anything to condemn it. They can lose some support.
Yeah, I can get your reservation. And if you ask me how you describe Turkey's democratization process, I mean, think about that. While you have only bicycle, the other day you would like to wake up with a like brand new Tesla. No, I mean, right now the clouds are extremely dark and gray. You have a bike, I didn't mention about it. The clouds are extremely dark. The first thing is that not a sunny day, but we would like to see the sky a little bit. So direct the democratic transformation is indeed very difficult, but don't forget about that. Even 2017, presidential referendum, I mean, 50% or 49.8% said no. This is something big, better than nothing. So.
I mean, it's sad to see Simon's optimism. It didn't last much, like talking about Turkey. So he reverted back to the general pessimism. I would say, thank you for the question. I would say, first we need to look at what is going to be replaced. Is there an ideological regime that is going to be replaced? I mean, we talk about anti-Erdoganism, which is more or less definable. But what is Erdoganism? So I think it's extremely difficult to be an Erdoganist, a coherent Erdoganist throughout the 20 years. So, for example, if you believe he is, let's say, a Sunni Islamist, then how would you explain him, Turkey cooperating with Russia in clearing out Aleppo in Syria from Islamists, which is the opposite of what a Sunni Islamist would do? Or how would you explain Turkish Iranian cooperation against Sunni Kurds in Kirkuk, for example? Or if he's let's say, you know, I mean, there's not much, if he's pro-Western or if he's pro-Russian. I mean, Turkey shot down a Russian fighter jet under his watch. Then the next moment, you know, if you're an Erdoganist at that moment, Russia is your enemy. A few months later, Russia is your best friend. It's difficult, like it's like an epigon, like whenever your leader changes the stage, you need to change. With that kind of, you know, that many moves that doesn't go well with an ideology. So you won't be like an Erdoganist. Like Erdoganist means following a leader, not necessarily following an ideology. So if you're not going to replace an ideology, it's much more easier. And the Turkish state under Erdogan's presidential system, he worked a lot to transform the system into this, is so centralized. And you won't need, for example, constitutional change for many practical changes on the ground. The presidential decrees are enough. Like sometimes even like gestures are enough. Like you say, you make a you know, speech on the television and the courts decide the way you want. So you don't it's and there's a repertoire which is shared by different political forces in Turkey. Let me give you a different example. For example, in the past, you know, this terrorism legislation was used very much very strongly against left-wing and Kurdish opposition by the secularist military. So, you know, any Kurdish, you know, expression or left-wing groups can be labeled as terrorists. Then the things changed. President Erdogan and at that time his allies, the Gülenist movement, used that legislation, terrorism legislation, against the same army, including, you know, putting many officers in jail under the terrorism legislation. So the army who invented that, you know, narrative were put under, including the former chief of general staff. Later, the prosecutors who put those you know, commanders in jail under terrorism legislation, they were put into the jail under terrorism, another terrorism legislation, the same terrorism legislation. So it's like Andy Warhol time, like everyone in Turkey is going to be a terrorist for 15 minutes at some point.
Easy.
It's very easy. Unpredictable though, like, you know.
I hope we don't.
Yeah, exactly.
My own
touch wood, yeah. And so, you know, this repertoire can easily be used, like, you know, President Erdogan used this power against his opponents. I mean, there are other examples. I think in Bangladesh, there was an example, you know, a party passed you know, autocratic legislation just before they lost an election, which the next party used against them. So I think that won't be that much of a difficult. The Kılıçdaroğlu, the current opposition leader, famously said actually a few months ago that it's easier to run the state, the Turkish state, than to run his own party, political party. I think there's some truth. There's some truth in that, because, you know, managing a party in opposition after all these years is extremely difficult, and remaining in power. And state in Turkish context is almost sacred. So if you ask, like, if you ask an ordinary Turkish person if they have to choose between, you know, the state, the God, or religion, or nation, their national identity, I think the state would come as the first. So if you're head of the state, you start from a, you know, 10 points in advance. Like, it's very easy to implement things. If, you know, him losing election, Simon, I you know, slightly disagree with you on that. He lost many elections, we say, but actually, who won any elections, or who won against Erdogan during this time? The all-powerful military were lost. The Gülenists were also very powerful inside the state, lost. The Kurds, for example, were, you know, very powerful at one point, challenging the state, completely lost. All liberal intellectuals was lost multiple times. The media, or pervasive Turkish media, completely lost. So I have to, I think, quote Trotsky here, who says, I didn't lose, it was the class I represented lost. I don't believe necessarily that was the case in Trotsky's case, but I think in Kılıçdaroğlu's case, it's very much the opposition he represented lost. It's not him. Like, even if you put, like, the most charismatic leader ever, some would say even Atatürk would have lost an election against against Erdogan during that time. For young leaders, I think if you're going to trust someone with such strong authority, I would really want someone. I think I follow Plato here. Like before age 40, nobody should be taught dialectics or like given state power. And there are some young leaders in Eastern Europe, that are not the best examples of what young people can lead Turkey to. So I think Kılıçdaroğlu is in a position where he proved himself to a certain degree that power won't corrupt him as much as it might corrupt other untested people. So yeah, that's and the repertoire, the strength of the regime today, the centralism is so high. And one example would be, like, I used to work at Amnesty International until a few months ago, and there was this disinformation law that was passed by the so-called disinformation law passed by the Turkish parliament, which basically can criminalize any untrue information. So the judiciary is stepping into the the zone of epistemology almost. But that legislation was passed by the AK Party, the ruling party. That legislation, if I were them, if I was advising them again, I would probably, argue that they shouldn't pass that legislation when they control so much of the media. So the next day, the new regime can use all those laws against all that media institutions.
Before we move on to, I think, the more informal discussion, so that everyone can enjoy the wine and piece together a little bit, I just wanted to introduce sort of a merged question from the Zoom audience, which is looking ahead towards the next 2 months. And it sort of touches on what you already addressed, but if very briefly you could answer what you expect from the elections. Will there be free elections? Is there any reason to doubt the freedom of the elections? And sort of connected to that, the freedom of speech, do you expect any last-minute changes to the media landscape, any last-minute actions that would curtail any kind of anti-Erdogan rhetoric over the coming 2 months?
I beg your pardon, you used the free election, freedom of speech, and Turkey in the same sentences. Okay, then.
Following up on the question of the two members of the Zoom audience, yes.
I mean, one of the main characteristics of being a competitive authoritarian regime, according to Levitsky, if I'm wrong, I mean, this means that there is an election, there is a competition, but at the same time, there is an authoritarian rules. This means that the controller, the authoritarian leader, the repressive leader, for example, staying like 90% in the TVs, the last is 10%. For example, he can make all the meetings, demonstrations, but there is a ban about the opposition, so on and so forth. So the conditions of the competition will not be very fair. The second thing is that what we know, the election security is always problematic in Turkey. It's not about only during the Justice and Development Party period. This is a heritage. So that is why, I mean, while we are talking about democracy, we need to consider about Alaturka style of democracy. While we are talking about the election, freedom of speech, security, we need to talk about the Turkish style of that. But, I mean, particularly after 2007, if I'm not mistaken, we saw many fantastic events. That is why Erdogan is capable to keep in power, right? No one think about that, about the coup attempt. No one think about what's going to happen during the Ergenekon cases, and then 2018. So, I mean, to predict or to say a couple of things about the last 2 months, 2.5 months, I mean, you have to be within the same mindsets. And I hope no one is the same mindsets with that authoritarian leader. So it is tough to guess, but I think we will see many surprising things. For example, as you said, there will be new scenarios about Kurds. There is new scenarios to dissolve the table of 6 again. And I mean, 2 or 3 days ago, there was a football match between Ahmet Spor, which is Diyarbakır Spor for Kurdish, and the Bursa Spor. We saw some of the billboards and the slogans about supporting the deep states. I mean, they have blood on their hands. So we will see maybe street events, some bombings in the capitals. So it's hard to guess. But my hope as a humankind will be a peaceful, maybe not fair, maybe not 100% equal, but peaceful election process.
Yeah, excuse me. I think that's It's more or less right. And I think we can kind of predict some things which will take place in the next couple of months. This is going to be an election which, for the most part, will be free, but certainly unfair. So if you were to go, I don't know, if you're going to have to take a drive down Istanbul, the main highways where, you know, lots and lots of cars are, lots of traffic, you will see the billboard posters mainly for the AKP and for Erdogan, and the less kind of crowded highways, you'll find them perhaps for the opposition. The airwaves, even the state media to the private media will be dominated by the AKP's message, and very few voices on radio and television would be heard for the opposition. That will be lingering for the most part in social media, which could get slowed down. HDP, so the kind of the main Kurdish and liberal party in the southeast of Turkey, it will be attacked. It always gets attacked ahead of elections, so their campaign offices will be targeted. They'll be challenged. You know, whether that's individuals attacking it or something more organized.
Even their
headquarters.
headquarters.
Happens. The headquarters. It will happen to every single election cycle, even when it's not an election, it happens. So that will certainly happen again. And these kind of things, you know, it's mostly free, but certainly unfair. And in the southeast of Turkey, where the earthquake struck, there is a state of an emergency. It could be extended to cover the electoral period, right? And that would be something which I think in that particular region, then we start to have to ask questions about, would it also be free? Because perhaps it wouldn't, in terms of logistics, in terms of vote counting and all those kind of things. The southeast of Turkey could be, it could be a trouble spot.
Not much to add apart from even if after all these scenarios, Turkish electorate delivers a vote that is 55% pro-opposition, then there's nothing the government could do. Then it will be implemented. So when I already talked about, they have to concede defeat if the margin of error, margin of defeat is beyond 2 points.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.